And it's my great pleasure to introduce Lizzie Bryant. Lizzie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. That's a wonderful introduction, and I really hope I can live up to your kind words. So welcome everybody, wherever you are. I'm in my living room in North Dorset in a tiny little village. Although I'm outside the Cranborne Chase Dark Sky Reserve, I'm not too far away. And I'm very fortunate that I also have really dark skies. And I just stepped out about 10 minutes ago doing some deep breathing, and the sky is so clear tonight. So after I've told you a few stories, I hope you'll wrap up warm and go outside and go walking in the sky and star hunt for yourself. So what do we talk about tonight? Well, this time of year, the winter, there are some constellations that just do stand out in the sky. Of course, the one that we nearly all can tell is Ursa Major. Well, this asterism, the Dipper, that we all know, and the one that we can use to find the North Star, like the outside stars, pointing to Polaris here. And if we stay up all night, we can watch the Dipper wheel around the fixed Polaris star. And this is the one constellation that we all know well, I'm sure. And there are so many stories right across the world that embed the Dipper into daily life and into the landscape and into culture. And when I was looking for some, I came across a blessing, and I'll read it to you. It says, "Risen above, the seven gods of the firmament guard us like a hat, guard us like a shadow. Please banish misfortune and evil spirits." And that is a blessing that comes from Mongolia. And that is a blessing that is often spoken in February, because in Mongolia in February, it's the White Moon Festival. It's the Mongolian New Year. It's not exactly the same as Chinese New Year. It's worked out on a lunar calendar. It happens 2 lunar months after the first new moon after the winter solstice. And this year it was at the beginning of February. But it is a very important time across all the regions of Mongolia. It is a time for families getting together. It is a time for wishing everybody prosperity and happiness. It is a time for greeting your relatives and hugging them and asking, are you living peacefully? And that would be a question for us all, wouldn't it? Right across the world in these troubled times. Are we living peacefully? And also at this time, the Dipper is revered. And it's not in the Mongolian cultures, it is not an asterism, a constellation that is about the cosmic hunt. It's not about hunting great bear or hunting elk. It is actually about 7 brothers, 7 gods, and even in some areas, 7 thieves. And so that made me quite curious. And so I started hunting for the stories. Now, it was quite frustrating because I either found just a story bones about these 7 brothers, or I was suddenly wading through these mile-long epics that if I told them to you tonight, will we be here till next Saturday? So I'd like to give you just a little flavour. And at this festival of winter moon, of the White Moon Festival, families, well, they dress in white, or they dress in their national costume, and they make lots of food that is white, rice, cheeses, milk, and they take fresh milk out and they offer it up into the sky to those 7 gods of the firmament. So, there were 2 brothers, young, healthy, virile warrior men, and they wanted adventure. They wanted to make their mark in the world. They wanted to be known as heroes. So they left their home and they went out searching for adventure. They went out across the wild steppes, through the mountains, over the hills, into the forests. And they were traveling for some days, when one day they came upon another man sitting under a larch tree. He had his hands around his ears. And when they got closer to him, this man said to them, "You've taken your time. I've been waiting for you." And the two brothers said, "How did you know we were coming?" And the man said, "I have ears that can hear grass growing. I can hear the breath of a hare. I could hear you walking and talking for the past 3 days. Now you want adventure, and so do I. So let me join with you." So Sharp Ear joined the two brothers, and the two became 3, and they set off. Now they hadn't been walking for that long when suddenly Sharp Ear put his hands over his ears, and it was so loud. The noise was so loud to him. The two brothers turned to him and said, "What can you hear?" And Sharp Ear said, "I can hear rocks being crushed." And he stuffed socks into his ears. They walked on, and they came to a small ravine amongst a low hill. And there they found a man, a giant of a man with bulging muscles. And he was picking up rocks the size of cattle, the size of cow, of an elk. And he was chucking them from one side to another. He stopped when he saw them and he said, "Where are you going?" And they answered, all 3. They said, "Well, we're going off to find adventure. We're going off to make our name." And he said, "Let me come too. For all I'm doing here is throwing rocks around. I'm sure I could be more useful." And so 3 became 4, and Rock Pusher joined them. Now they kept going for a while, and as they were crossing the grassy steppe, they saw a whirlwind approaching them. The wind and the dust was rising up like a great shadow coming towards them at great speed, and it stopped right in front of them. And as the dust cleared, there was a man, and he was tall and wiry with the longest legs. He could run fast, Fleetfoot. And Fleetfoot joined the band of growing brothers, all eager and seeking adventure. And off they went, the 2 brothers, Sharp-Eared, Rock Pusher, and Fleetfoot. We have 5 brothers. Now those 5 brothers travelled together until they came to the edge of a great lake. Now that lake, you couldn't see one end or the other. It was like a sea. And they waited at a small jetty, waiting for a boat to come and take them across. But no boat came. And they sat down for a while, sharing stories, wondering what they should do. And just then, out of the distance, came another man. And he walked towards them and he said, "Is there a boat?" And they turned round and said, "No boat. We've been waiting for ages." And this man said, "Well, we could swim." And the brothers said, "That's too far to swim. Can't even see the other side of the lake." And so the new man said, "I've got a skill." And so he went to the edge of the water. And he took a deep breath. He was a guzzler. He soaked up and guzzled up all the water of the lake. Well, not all of it, but just enough for the level to drop, drop, drop until they could wade across. And they waded across the lake to the other side, and then the guzzler put the water back, and he joined their band of brothers. And on they walked, talking about the adventures they were looking to have. And they walked up and up and up a hill. And standing at the top of the hill, was a magnificent looking man. He was backlit by the sun. He stood there tall, and in his hand he had a bow, and he was holding it up as if he had just let go of the string, and he was looking up, up, up into the sky. And he was still looking up as the other 6 crowded around him, and they all looked up in the sky too, and they said, "What are you looking at?" And the tall archer said, "Well, I've shot an arrow, and I'm waiting to see if it is hitting its mark." And they looked at him and said, "Well, what have you shot?" They couldn't see anything in the sky. And the archer said, "A bird, but a long way away. I'll wait here. We'll see if it comes down." The others couldn't believe it. How could an arrow take so long to find its mark and make its way down? And the archer said, "Well, it has gone a long way. Maybe not as far as the sun. Maybe not as far as my great ancestor, Erkai Mergen." Now he looked around for recognition, but the 6 brothers looked at him and looked at each other and, "Erkai Mergen? No, we've not heard of him." The archer raised an eyebrow and, "Not heard of Erkai Mergen, the father of all archers, my ancestor?" They all shook their heads. And seeing as the arrow, or the bird that he had been trying to catch, to hit with his arrow, hadn't come down, they all sat down on the ground. They knew they were going to get a story. In ancient times, long, long, long ago, there was not one son, but 7 sons. 7 sons that would come up in the sky all together every morning. As you can imagine, those 7 sons produced enormous heat, and the earth suffered. The rivers all dried up, the lakes drained away, the trees wilted, the plants went hot and crispy and dried up, and all the animals and humans were suffering, and they couldn't survive much longer. And so the people knew there was only one thing to do, one last resort they could take. And they went to see Erkai Mergen. Now, Erkai Mergen was the best archer in the whole world. He was in the prime of his life. He had thumbs that were so strong, and his liver was full of gall, and he pumped blood full of vigor, and he was very, very confident. And the people came rushing to him, and they said, "Erkai, Erkai, we will die if these 7 sons are not got rid of. Can you shoot them down for us? Please, you're our only hope." Well, Erkai loved to hear that he was needed so much, and he was sure of his talents. He was sure of his arm, of his strong thumbs, of his good sight. He would make true aim, and he would do what they asked. And so he stood before them and he said, "People, do not worry. I make this boast. I will shoot down those 7 sons. I will save mankind. Now, such is my boast that I will only use 7 arrows, 1 for each son. And if I do not manage this, I do not deserve to be the world's best archer, and I will cut off my thumbs." And so he took his bow and his best 7 arrows. And early in the dawn of the next morning, he set out, and he walked and he walked and he walked till he got to the highest hill, and he waited for the suns to come out. Not one, not two, 3, 4, 7 suns rose together up into the sky, and their heat was felt by all. He took his bow, he took an arrow, he knocked it, he pulled back the gut string, and he aimed and let the first arrow fly. And it flew straight and true to the first sun, and the first sun exploded and disappeared. Good start. And so he took another arrow and he ran to the next hill and he shot again, and the second one went. And another arrow, he was on a roll now, and the third one went down, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the 6th. His heart was beaming with pride and joy. Just one last sun, and he let go of the arrow, and he watched it fly straight and true towards the sun. And just then it was knocked off course by a swallow. A swallow flew past, and the arrow flipped through its tail, forking the swallow's tail, and it would be so forevermore, but just enough to divert the arrow, and the arrow fell to the ground. Well, Erkai, he was furious. That damn swallow had stopped him getting rid of 7 suns. And he turned round and he ran back and he got his horse. And he said to his horse, "You will run like the wind and we will get that swallow. That swallow is going to pay for me not getting that 7th sun." And so he jumped on his horse. And his horse, which was a talking horse, because as you know, all horses in Mongolia talk and understand humans. And the horse turned to him and said, "I will honour you, dear Erkai, and I promise to run like the wind. And if we do not catch this swallow before that 7th sun sets below the mountain, then cut off my legs, because I don't deserve to be a horse." And so he ran like the wind, and Erkai rode like the wind, and they chased that swallow up and down the steps, but the swallow was swift and fast, and they couldn't catch it. And the poor horse's heart was thumping in its chest, but wouldn't give up. He galloped as hard as he'd ever galloped in his whole life. But the 7th sun started sinking down in the west. The sun had disappeared, and the swallow had not been caught. And so, because Erkai was a man of his own honour, as was his horse, he chopped off his thumbs, and he stopped being a man, and he turned into a marmot which runs around Mongolia and lives deep in the earth and drinks stale water and eats old grass. And the horse now with small legs turned into a gerbera, a little rat-like creature which hops and hops and hops around. But perhaps it was good that one son did not get shot down. When the archer had finished telling this tale of his ancestor Ergai Mergen, he looked up, and there was a whistling sound, and a bird dropped to his feet with an arrow impaled in it. And he picked it up, and they cooked the bird, and they carried on, now 7 brothers wanting adventure. Now, in these long, epic tales of adventure, heroes go off and save parents and children and queens from some mangy monster. And in this case, they found a Khan, a king, whose wife, the queen, had been abducted by a mangy monster. And this mangy monster had 7 heads, very common in Mongolia, multi-headed monsters. And this multi-headed monster, he had 1 head for looking. He had 1 head for boasting. He had 1 head for cursing. He had 1 head for chewing his victims up. He had 1 head for burping foul odors. And he had 1 head for coughing dangerous diseases out. And he had a 7th head for spitting poison. And he had stolen this queen away, along with all sorts of other people, and he kept them chained up in a secret cave. Well, between the talents of the 7 brothers, they tracked that cave down. And they waited till the mangy monster had gone away for the day. And they crept inside. And the 2 brothers, well, they saw the queen chained up. And she was all alone, surrounded by the bones of all the other victims. And the queen, well, she was glad to see them, but she said, "It's hopeless. He's coming back to eat me. And you all look very skilled and you all look very strong, but it's very hard to kill a 7-headed monster, especially when his heart is not kept inside his body. His heart and soul is kept somewhere else." And the brothers asked him, "Where is it kept? Do you know?" And the queen says, "Well, I do, but even though I know, I can't go and get it." And they entreated her to tell them. And she said, "His heart, his soul is kept inside an egg. And that egg is inside a box. And that box is in the belly of a salmon that swims at the bottom of the deepest lake, miles from here." Well, as soon as she'd said the words, "a bottom of a lake," 6 brothers turned to the Guzzler, the one who could drink water. And they said, "That's a job for you." Now, Sharp-Eared was keeping an ear out, and he heard that the monster was on his way back. So Fleetfoot put Guzzler on his back, and they ran like the wind to the lake. And the Guzzler got to work to drain the lake, to find the salmon, to catch it, to get the box, and inside the egg. And inside that, the heart of the 7-headed monster. And meanwhile, the head that is good for looking on the monster saw that the queen was not alone. And so he came charging. He came charging, spitting and coughing and cursing and boasting that he was going to kill these brothers. And meanwhile, Stone Pusher was collecting rocks, and Fleetfoot was running hard back from the lake with Guzzler on his back. And Sharp-Eared was listening out for the monster's return and for the Guzzler's return. And there was a battle. Stones were thrown. The runner ran round and round and round the monster, tying him up. The brothers used their swords. The archer let his arrows go, killing each head. And after many, many hours, the monster was defeated. The queen was taken back to the Khan. There was rewards, there was feasting, and the 7 brothers carried on their way, on to the next adventure, on to the next grand heroic feat. Now, at the White Moon Festival in February, people light 14 incense sticks. 7 are for the 7 brothers in the Dipper, the Dolun Buran, the 7 brothers, those 7 gods of the firmament. And they're very special because this is New Year, and Mongolia is a little bit like China, that they have their zodiac animals for each year. I think is it the year of the rat this year? I can't remember. But those animals of the zodiac are also associated with one of the 7 stars of this dipper. So they can also pray to an individual star in the dipper. Now, we had some very cold stargazing a couple of nights ago. And one of the things the young people were able to point out, I'm afraid my eyesight's too bad, and without binoculars, I cannot see the extra star that's hiding on the sort of second star of the handle of the dipper. So this star here of the handle has a star behind it called Alcor. Well, in classical sense, we call this Mizar and Alcor. Now, if you're young or you've got good eyesight, you can see that with your naked eye, or you can look through binoculars. And in many stories, that's a character. Sometimes it's a woman who's been stolen by the 7 brothers or the 7 thieves, and other people are trying to get her back. Or even when you look at the Orion and the Pleiades stories from Greece, this has often said to have been Electra, who was one of the Pleiades sisters, who married and ended up in this constellation. So it's an intriguing. There's always a story connected with that extra star in the dipper. One of the many of the First Nation stories, especially up in Canada, have this as a hunter carrying a cooking pot. So the hunter being Chickadee with his cooking pot as they go and hunt the bear. So the 14 incense sticks that the Mongolians will light, 7 will be for these 7 brothers, these 7 gods of the dipper, and 7 will be for the Pleiades, this star cluster that's in the constellation of Taurus, which is this here. And the Pleiades are an important star cluster to the Mongolians, because it's from there that the sky gods got together and decided that man was having such a problem with disease and disaster and war that they decided to send down the first shaman in the form of an eagle. So the wonderful thing about the Pleiades is that there are so many stories. It seems to be a very important star cluster for us humans from time immemorial. And I think partly because it sits very close to the ecliptic, so that's the pathway of the stars, of the planets, and the sun and the moon. And one of the wonderful things that's coming out over the last 10 years or so is that this idea of 7 sisters is so prevalent across the whole world, not exclusively, but very prevalent across the whole world. And it appears to be this idea of the hunter Orion chasing the Pleiades, who in classical Greek mythology were the daughters of Pleione and Atlas. And in the end, Zeus turned them into doves or pigeons or some kind of bird so that they could escape Orion's sort of lustful eye. And but that 7 sister story, this basic motif of a hunter chasing women, appears not only through Europe, but also through the Americas and also in Australia. And considering that, Aboriginal Australians have lived on that land for 65,000 years, those stories are very, very old. And I don't know, I was very lucky recently, thanks to a friend who reminded me to go, but recently there was this extraordinary exhibition down at the Box in Plymouth called Songlines, Tracking the 7 Sisters. And I'm afraid it's finished now, but if you go to Europe, I know it's going to be turning up in some European country, I'm not quite sure, but it was this fantastic multimedia, like art and dance and weaving and some beautiful film, and looking at the song lines, the dreaming tracks that cover this story of the 7 sisters being chased by a man or a group of men. And it was an extraordinary exhibition. And actually, the other exhibition, while I just noticed it, is if you've got till July to see it, is the Stonehenge exhibition, the World of Stonehenge at the British Museum. I went on Sunday, and I've got the fridge magnet to show for it. And that is awesome to see. That is the Nebra sky disk, which is the oldest representation of the cosmos in terms of the Pleiades. The Pleiades star cluster, and it's just to see that in real life was just extraordinary. So I urge you all to go to the British Museum before July to see that. So I wanted to go back down to Australia and look at one of those stories. And this one has some other really interesting detail about it. So this story, let's grab some water. This story belongs to the Kokatha people, and they are part of the Great Western Desert culture, and they are in sort of northwest South Australia, so at the edge of the Nullarbor Plain. So it's a very arid landscape. It's a very harsh landscape. There's often a long distance between waterholes. So to be able to thrive out there, you know, you need quite a lot of skills, which, you know, Aboriginals, all the different nations of the Aborigine cultures in Australia, they have so much knowledge that doesn't need to be written down because theirs is an oral culture. Their whole knowledge is not segregated into subjects. Their knowledge, their dreaming is encoded in the landscape. It's encoded in the sky. It's encoded in their bodies, in their songs, in their dances, in their corroborees. And it's fascinating. So this is one of these stories about the hunter. Now I have to say, remember they're down the other side in the southern hemisphere, so they see this upside down. So Orion's like this, and the Pleiades is down here. Just this won't balance on there like that. So there was this hunter, and his name was Niarana. He was a great hunter. He was a vain hunter, and he loved to tell anyone who would listen the exploits of his hunting. But no one liked to listen because he was a hunter of women, and no one liked their attention, the attention of him on them. And Niarana, well, he had set his sights on these 7 sisters, these 7 sisters of the Mingari totem, the thorny lizard. They didn't want his attention, but he didn't care. He'd set his sights on them. And so he came swaggering under the sun in front of them. As they sat under the mulga tree, they were grinding grass seeds. Well, he bothered them as they sat in the grasses, and they sat there digging for tubers and roots and yams. They ignored him. They did not want his attention. But still, he came around, talking when he wasn't invited, trying to find his way, to have his way with them. They did their best to ignore him. They did their best to turn their backs on him. Even when they were out picking the fruits of the ruby salt bush, he was there. He was there teasing them, trying to flatter them. They hated it. He's so rude. He's ugly. He stinks. We don't like him. But he didn't take the message. He didn't take no for an answer. And soon it got uncomfortable. And the sisters, the Mingari sisters, hated it. They needed to do something. So they went to their older sister, Kambaguda, and they told her their troubles. She listened. She listened to them moaning about this man, Nearuna. She listened as she heard all the things that he would say and do. And she said, well, he's a bully, and I will come and protect you. And that's what she did. So the next time Nearunna came skulking around their camp, he found on the path towards the sisters that it was blocked. And there was this strong-looking woman standing there with her legs wide apart and her arms crossed and a stony expression on her face. Well, he tried to ignore that and he tried to walk round her, but her hand went out. She said, "Stop, you're not going in there." And in that moment, his eyes flashed with anger and he went, "Who are you to stop me?" And Cambaguda looked at him and she said, "Those are my sisters. Those are my sisters and they do not want you. You can go away." Well, Nearunna shifted his position quickly and the frown turned to a smile and he said, "Oh, I've heard all about you. I've heard all about you. Cambaguda." Got off on the wrong foot. Let us be friends. Let's get to know you. Well, we're going to be family, aren't we? And she looked at him and she said, "Only in your imagination." But he was nothing if not determined. And so he stood there trying to get on with Cambaguda. He stood there and he regaled her with tales of his exploits, of his hunting, of his prowess, of how brilliant he was. And Cambaguda looked at him and said, "Whatever you say, Nearunna, but no, you're not going in there." And so he turned to flattery. He started telling Cambaguda how beautiful she was, how strong she looked, how magnificent she was, and how beautiful her sisters were, and how he wanted to marry them, how he was planning to marry them. When his charm had worn out, she looked at him and she said, "Nearunna, no." By now, Nearunna was getting impatient. In fact, that lust that was boiling inside of him had shape-shifted into rage, and he was clutching his hand open and shut, as that rage started coursing through his veins. And he said to Cambaguda, he said, "You know, you're going to let me pass. I don't want to use force." And Cambaguda, well, by now her left foot was tapping impatiently on the red-brown earth. And she said, "You say you don't want to use force, but you know you will. You always do. And look, I'm warning you." "Warning me?" Nearunna exploded in fury. He said, "You don't get to warn me." And with that, he raised his hand, his clutching hand, and he opened up. And there was a fireball in his hand, and he slammed it towards Cambaguda. And at the same moment, Cambaguda, she stamped her left foot on the ground. She kicked it hard, and she kicked it in the air towards him. And out came a burst of flame and white-hot sand all over the fireball, making it drop to the ground and disappear into nothing. Nearunna was shocked. Cambaguda smiled and she said, "You're not the only one with fire magic." Nearunna slumped and skulked away. But as he walked away, he said, "I'll be back." Cambaguda knew he would come back. And she knew that she couldn't just snap her fingers and get that fire magic in her foot whenever she wanted. It took time to build up. So she knew she needed some extra help. She went to see Baba Dingo, Father Dingo, and she told him about Nearunna, and she said, "I need some help. I need some extra protection." And Father Dingo gave her a pack of pups, a pack of dingo pups. And Cambaguda took them home and started to train them so that they would grow up to be great guard dogs. Unfortunately, they didn't grow up quick enough. And after some time, Nearunna's fire magic came back, and he came back to claim what he thought was rightfully his. He was going to have the Mingari sisters as his wives, and he didn't care about Cambaguda and what she thought, or what even the sisters thought. Well, there was no charming words. There was no flattery. He just came with his firearm, his fire magic crackling. Cambaguda could hear him coming from miles away. And she shouted to her pups, "Shield wall!" And the pups all gathered together, all eager, snapping their teeth and tails up and creating a wall around her and in front of the Mingari sisters, who by now were so scared. They had turned into their totem animal, their thorny lizard, and they were hiding in the crevices of the rocks. And he came thundering in there, Ruma, with his arm out, ready to throw the fireball and extinguish the pups, extinguish Cambaguda, whose fire magic hadn't come back yet. Well, Cambaguda knew she only had a split second, and she opened her mouth wide, and with every cell in her body, she called, "Baba Dingo, I need your help!" And as Nearuna came storming into the camp, about to let loose his fireball, there was a streak of light through the air, and the great Baba Dingo landed and then leaped towards Nearuna and opened his wide jaws and snapped across the middle, catching Nearuna. Well, Nearuna's firepower went out straight away, and he fell over like a limp rag doll. And then the dingo father, he swung Nearuna from side to side, from east to west. And as he did, Cambaguda laughed at him. The Mingari sisters laughed at him. All the stars in the sky laughed and jeered and humiliated him. Even the moon, even Kara the spider. When Father Dingo finally let loose his jaws, and Nearuna dropped to the floor, he fell into a puddle of his own humiliation. He crawled away. Everybody cheered. Cambaguda, she smiled, but she also sighed, because she knew Nearuna would come back one day. She knew Nearuna would always try to chase the sisters. She knew the story would go on and on and on. Now, what's interesting about that story, not that it's just a great example of the idea, this motif of the hunter chasing the women and the women not really keen to accept his offers, is this idea of the fire magic. And what's so wonderful, and I didn't do this before because I thought it would just give away too much, but if we look at just the outline of the stars here. So this is Orion. You've got the belt of the Orion. And this star up here is a very large red star called Betelgeuse, which you may have heard of. And it's one of those super red stars. It's like 1,000 times bigger than the sun. And I'm not very good with facts and figures, so I'll leave that to Steve. And in the traditional sense, that's his club, and that's his shield. And here in Taurus, you've got Aldebaran, which is another red star. And over here, you've got the Pleiades. So just in the way that this is set out, you can see here the Mingari sisters, the Pleiades. Here, Aldebaran is the foot of Cambaguda. And the Hyades, which is another star cluster, which appears as a V shape by Aldebaran. That is the V shape of Cambaguda, standing with her legs set apart and standing very strong against Nearuna, which is Orion the hunter. And this is his fire magic arm. But what's even more brilliant, really, because it just shows that these stories, which are very, 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 very ancient, that the Aboriginal people were quite able, they are pioneer astronomers. They are quite able to observe and incorporate into their stories the very fact that both of these stars can vary in brightness. So Betelgeuse can vary in brightness, varies in brightness by some magnitude. Again, I can't remember those sorts of facts, but about every 400 days can vary in brightness. And there's been some quite distinctive variations in brightness that have been recorded in recent history, and the same with Aldebaran. But what's so brilliant in the story is that Aldebaran varies less frequently and not very regularly than Betelgeuse does, which happens quite regularly every 400 days. So again, that works completely how the story plays out. And the shield wall of the puppies, of the dingo pups, is this part of Orion. So I just love the sort of the topography, how this is all encoded into the landscape, into the skyscape. And so that's one of my favorite Pleiades stories, because there's just so much going on there. And as for where the dingo comes from, what star Father Dingo may be, there's two researchers at the University of New South Wales in Australia, Dwayne Hamaker and Kevin Lehman, I think their names are, who wrote a lot of papers, talking about this, have posited that perhaps one proposal is that Baba Dingo may have been that sort of flash of light coming across, may have been a supernova. There was a supernova in 1054, which then created the Crab Nebula in the kind of Taurus area, that they're suggesting that could be a possibility. So again, this idea of the old stories incorporating and encoding within their narrative celestial phenomena is a fascinating subject. I absolutely love it. The other thing I wanted to mention before we leave is in terms of that story being recorded, there's another interesting character. She's an Irish woman, and she was born in 1859, and she was orphaned very young. But she was one of these extraordinary characters who managed to kind of reinvent herself her whole life. And she emigrated to Australia, and she ended up spending about 40 years living amongst Aborigines, and particularly amongst the Kokatha and the Gilia nations out in South Australia. And she's a controversial figure. She certainly spent a long time literally living in a tent amongst their camps. This prim Edwardian dressed woman with very sort of tight net and a hat and buttoned up and corsets and an umbrella, something like a Mary Poppins figure. She had, she was still part of kind of the colonial drive of eradicating Aborigines. And she held very colonial views, which would not make her very completely unacceptable today. But on the other hand, she also had real interest in their culture and recorded a lot of things. And she had a particular interest, an amateur interest in astronomy and the night sky, and did a lot of work recording some of those stories. And obviously, as time has gone by, there are certain aspects of those stories that are not to be shared, because those stories have many, many layers to do with whether it's men's business or women's business, or things that we're not a party to, and that's we have to respect that. Even sharing this story, I completely acknowledge that this story belongs to those people and belongs to those pioneers who had a way of looking at the world that we can only imagine, and because they don't see a separation between mankind and nature, and let us all follow that path a little bit more. So time is up. So I wanted just to end by telling you this. This is another little proverb or saying from Mongolia. There is an old woman in heaven who has a skin sack containing the wind. If she is angry, she opens her sack and the wind blows on earth. If she is furious, She opens the sack wider and wider, and the wind becomes stronger. When she is in good spirits, she closes the sack and the wind drops. Thus, people shouldn't willfully offend the old woman. So thank you very much for being here, and go and wrap up warm now and go and look at the night sky. And thank you very much to the Cranborne Chase AONB and the Dark Sky team. And it's always a lovely privilege to be able to share stories. I'd like to just give a quick shout out to Gary at Pageant Productions for lending me lights for this evening. Very kind of him, a film production company in Dorchester. And I hope to maybe meet some of you in person, doing a night walk somewhere or huddled around a fire and doing real Star Walk stories in the night sky. So thank you very much, and go peacefully.
Lizzie, thank you. I'm so grateful that you can come and do this for us. And I reiterate what you say. If you get a chance, once we're sort of opened up again, come and see Lizzie live. Absolutely fantastic experience. That was the way I was introduced to Lizzie, and I'm so glad it happened. So again, to all of you, thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Night, night.